Good evening and welcome back to Drawing Closer to God. Again, my name is Wayne Gautney, pastor to senior adults here at Stetson Baptist Church in DeLand, Florida. Thank you so much for joining in. Last week we talked about the prophet Elijah and his confrontation with the king Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And as I said, Ahab was considered the most wicked king that Israel had ever had on the scene. His son was King Jehoram. Jehoram was not as wicked as his father, but not as obedient as it was expected of a king of Israel to be. And Elijah faced off against Ahab, Jezebel, and the prophets of Baal there on Mount Carmel. This week we're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 6. If you have your Bible and you want to follow along with me, please do so. Let me set the background here. Now, after Ahab and Jezebel, King Jehoram comes on the scene, and he is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, after King David and after King Solomon, Israel was divided as a nation. And so you had the northern kingdom with 10 tribes, and it was called Israel. Then the southern kingdom called Judah, which consisted of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. And at this time, Elijah and his protege, Elisha, were servants of God in the northern kingdom. Now, Elijah is not on the scene anymore. It's Elisha. And Elisha is God's spokesman to the nation. He is the prophet. That's what the word prophet means, is literally to be a mouthpiece of God. And so God would speak to Elisha. Elisha would speak to the nation and to the king. Now, as we get into this story, what was happening is the king of Samaria, a neighboring kingdom, would organize these raiding parties, these small armies, militias, whatever you want to call them. They would be sent into various parts of Israel and have these raiding attacks where they would come in and they would plunder and they would make off with goods from Israel. And, this king of Syria was really trying to get some revenge after all of his defeats in trying to attack Israel. He really wanted to conquer that northern kingdom of Israel. And so he would tell his commanders, his generals, he'd say, all right, we're going to attack this certain place in Israel. And here's when we're going to do it, and here's how many troops we're going to take. Now, all of these secret communications that the king of Syria was making with his commanders and generals, God allowed this communication to be something that Elisha was privy to through the Holy Spirit, through God, telling Elisha all of these things that were going to happen. And so Elisha would send communications to the king of Israel, King Jehoram, and let him know that, listen, your enemies are going to be attacking Israel at this particular place, this particular time. And so he was always well advised as to what was going to happen ahead of time. And so King Jehoram would send spies or troops to scout the area just to confirm what the prophet Elisha was telling him. And so they would go, they would spy on the area, and sure enough, here comes the Syrian troops right where it was planned to be. Now, the Syrians had this supposed intelligence on where the king of Israel was going to be traveling. Even today, you'll hear that the President of the United States is moving, or he's in an undisclosed location, and that's all for security reasons. And so they don't publish his route or where, his itinerary. And for the same reason, as we see here. And so Elisha, through God's help, was protecting the king of Israel from these raids, what could potentially be an assassination. And the king of Syria became so angry because after several of these attempts, he's got good intelligence that the king is going to be here, 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 this place or that place. He sends his troops, and the king's nowhere to be found. And so he suspects that one of his generals, one of his commanders, is secretly feeding information to the king of Israel. And so he gathers them together. He is very angry, and he says, I want to know who is leaking this information to the king of Israel. And they said, I don't know how they knew, but they said, no, king, none of us are betraying you. What's happening is there is a prophet in Israel, and everything that you say, even in your bedroom, these private conversations, God is making known your intentions, your conversations to this prophet Elisha. And so the king says, all right, where is this Elisha? Well, he lives in Dothan. Well, we're going to send an entire army, just this huge garrison of troops, after Elisha, this one prophet. And so during the night, he sends his troops. They're all gathering quietly around this town of Dothan. And they assemble their chariots, their horses, their soldiers with spears and so forth. And they are ready for sunrise to go and to take this man of God, Elisha. And Elisha's servant goes out in the morning, and he is dumbfounded when he looks around and he sees the entire house of Elisha is surrounded by this gigantic army. And he's, of course, very fearful. And he runs back in and tells Elisha what's going on. And Elisha comes out to meet the army. And he tells his servant not to fear, because the ones who are with us, he says, are greater than our enemies. And the servant is still just shaking in his boots there. He is afraid because of this great army that he sees in front of his eyes. And so Elisha very calmly prays to the Lord and says, Lord, open the eyes of this servant so that he can see. And so God does, he allows this servant to see what is happening all around the mountains that surround this valley where Elisha lives in Dothan. And on the ridge, all the way around the city, the servant could see these flaming chariots and horses, the armies of God that are assembled all around the city. They're surrounding Dothan, and they are surrounding this army from Syria. And then Elisha prays to God. He says, God, please strike this army with blindness. And God does, immediately. These men are young, strong, trained soldiers. Now they're wandering around. They can't see a thing. And he says, I will take you to the man you're seeking. And so Elisha and his servants, they lead this army. The army just trusts Elisha at this point. Elisha leads them from Dothan into Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom. So Dothan's on the outskirts. He leads them into the heart of this enemy nation of Israel. And so he gets the troops all gathered there, literally in front of the king's palace. And then he says, God, open their eyes. And then as their vision returns, the troops, the commanders, they recognize, oh no, we're in trouble. Not only are we caught in Israel, we're caught in the capital. And we're surrounded by Israel's troops. The king is here. We're dead. In fact, the king comes out, Jehoram, and he looks at Elisha and he says, Father, shall I strike them down, kill them? And Elisha says, no, don't do that. Prepare a feast for these men. And so the king did as Elisha instructed him, and he prepared a great feast. He fed this army of Syria, and then he sent them home. I'm sure they escorted them out of Israel, but sent them back to their king in Syria with this amazing story of God's power and God's mercy on them. Certainly they had, at that moment, they could have been easily killed and done away with. But they were treated with respect and kindness and returned home. And for a long time after that, there were no more raids into the nation of Israel. Now, we'll find out later that Syria does try another attack later on, but it's a full-fledged attack. But no more of these raids took place for a long, long time after this. So, let's get into this for a minute. And so, some of the things that I thought were interesting here. First of all, if you're worried about Alexa hearing your conversations so that you get certain ads on your phone or on your computer, just remember, God is the one with the recorder on for our entire lives. Not only does He know the places we go, the things we say, the actions that we do, but He records the very thoughts of our hearts and minds, the intentions, the emotions behind our decisions that we make. Everything is recorded in glorious detail. There is nothing that is missed by God. If you're afraid what you might say over Alexa or Siri or something like that, we need to be much more careful to think about what we're saying and the things that come out of our mouths and the actions that we do, because someone far more important and far greater is recording every action. And just like God recorded the secret conversations of the king of Syria, He knows our thoughts. So that ought to be a reminder to each of us to live in such a way that we would be honored with everything that God sees and observes in our lives. Another thing is, it's very interesting, when Elisha prayed, it wasn't some long discourse. You remember when the prophets of Baal prayed last week, and they were praying to Baal. I mean, they literally prayed for 8 hours or more, and they were cutting themselves and doing all these things. And then after Elijah prepares the altar, he just prays one simple prayer, and God answers immediately in great power and displays His might and His strength. And in the same way, Elisha just prays these simple prayers. And they're not anything that's long or complicated. He just says, God, strike them with blindness. Boom, it happens. God, take their blindness away. Boom, it happens. In the New Testament, we see that Jesus condemns the Pharisees. He says they think that they will be heard because of their long prayers. But really, when a believer is in tune with the Lord, we don't have to communicate in such pretentious long prayers. It's just maybe even just a prayer that's breathed in a very quick way to the Lord. Lord, help me. I need you. Lord, would you supply this need? Lord, will you help someone who needs healing? It just amazes me, the simplicity of the prayers that we see here. Now, first thing I want to mention, a believer cannot live in faith and fear at the same time. Let me say that again. A believer cannot live in faith and fear in the same time. Because you see, when we have faith in God, that means we're trusting Him to take care of us, no matter what. Now, that doesn't mean He will always rescue us from a situation. We know from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that there were many Christians who were faithful and had faith in the Lord, but they died at the hands of sinful men. They were persecuted and killed because of their faith. God is not saying that He will rescue us from the perils of this earth that are around us. He's not going to necessarily protect us from COVID or disease or car accidents or whatever. But our faith is such that we trust Him that no matter what happens to us, we're always going to be within His care, and we're going to have the best life that we can possibly live, whether it's here on earth or in eternity in heaven. We can't give in to the fear of man. We can't give in to sin when we are living in faith. Those two don't mix. We either live in faith or we live in fear. And we know that God is greater, and He displayed His greatness in this story that we're looking at tonight. The next point I want to make is that God can guide us in ways that are beyond human understanding or even capability. Notice how God gave Elisha the ability to know the communications, the private communications of the king of Syria. There was no internet, no secret recording devices, but God relayed the things the king of Syria was whispering to his commanders across that great distance to his home there in Dothan, and he communicated those things to the king. God can do the supernatural through us when we place our faith in Him and our trust in Him. And another thing I want to share is that faithful believers have God's power because it is used for His glory. Faithful believers have God's power because it is used for His glory. So when God gets a hold of our hearts, He changes our heart to become more like His heart. And that's what we want. We want our heart to reflect the heart of God. And when we do, as we become more and more like Christ and having the mind of Christ, then what happens is our desires match up with God's desires. And when that's the case in a believer's life, we have the power of God at our disposal. That's why in James it says, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man accomplishes much. And so the level of our faith reflects the level of the power that God can use through us because of our obedience. It's just like talking about that glove illustration. If we're going to be a tool in God's hand, we have to be a tool that functions, that works, that trusts Him. And so when we become that faithful tool that He can use, He can display His power even through our feeble lives. Tonight we're going to look at that scene there in Dothan as Elisha's house is surrounded by this army from Syria. It's a very threatening scene, and yet in the background we're going to see what the servant of Elisha was allowed to see, those chariots of fire surrounding the city and surrounding this army from Syria. And just a reminder that God is all-powerful. He's got the situation in hand always. God is bigger. He is greater than anything we'll face in this life. And we know that as we put our faith and trust in Him, we'll be protected, we'll be provided for, and we will have the best life that we can possibly have as we put our faith in Him. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you can join us next week. And right now, just enjoy the painting, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.